Your name is? Margit. No one's a trainee, right? I saw that correctly because it doesn't show me. Good. Okay, good. So we're all in here together. Before we begin, I will go through a few formalities. In open government, we should have Kiel A with Raoul and Alexander. Who's speaking first?
Alexander.
Alexander. And Alexander, do you have any preferred pronoun?
Yeah, I'm what we call he.
Okay, he. Raoul, do you have a preferred pronoun?
Yes, he.
Okay, very good. In opening opposition, I should have Moscow IPT B with Dalia and Andrei.
Andrew, you first.
Andrew, you prefer?
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. So, Andrew, and you're speaking first. Andrew, do you have a preferred?
No, he.
Okay. Dalia, do you have a preferred pronoun?
Yeah, she was like.
She or they. Okay, no problem. Thank you. In closing government, we should have Cornell Qatar A with Ahmed and Amina.
Yes, I'm not going first.
Amina?
Amna.
Amna. Okay, it says Amina here.
It's the same spelling, it's just a difference.
Okay, so Amna, no problem. And Amna, do you have a preferred pronoun?
She, her.
She or her? Ahmed, do you have a preferred pronoun?
He, whatever.
He or whatever, perfectly fine. In opening opposition, we should have ASE Bucharest A with Andre and Laura.
Oh, Laura speaking first?
Laura, sorry.
Okay.
Pardon?
No people.
She or they?
Yeah.
Okay, and Andre, no. Okay, we're done with that. I
Are we
won't.
being filmed?
Yeah, that's exactly the next thing I wanted to ask. So as you can see, there's a huge system here to live stream this debate. Of course, that has to do with consent of, I think, all of you. Am I correct, or is it just? Can some people say yes and some? You'll all have a chance to see yourselves just as I see you now.
Oh.
Okay. So, God, these things are getting longer and longer every year, aren't they? So, without further ado, we call upon Alexander to open this debate. The motion is brand new and fresh out of the oven.
Thank you, Michael. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we want to prohibit the private ownership of art deemed to be culturally or historically significant. How do we gonna do this? Well, we put the art into the public domain, so there's no private ownership anymore possible. We give the rights, for example, if a museum wants to use if the museum wants to use the art for a public exhibition, for example, they can get the rights from the state by request, and if everything is fair and people can get access to the art, and the art itself will be preserved, which are the two main goals, then we say, all right, we grant them the request. So the process will be, it goes from the private owners back to the state and back to somewhere where it's then curated and everything public. So for the sake of the debate, we need to define what is culturally or historically significant. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I, as the Prime Minister, and we as a team, we don't dare to define what is historically or culturally significant because we don't have the knowledge about that. Although we recognize that all of us know that there are some art that is, of course, historically or culturally significant. For example, the Mona Lisa. Like everybody knows exactly that is the example. So we believe that there is like a general consensus what will be deemed important, and it is a big process which is out of the scope of this debate and which should not be defined because it's entangled with many scientists, with people, with public opinion, with journalists and all this stuff, and this is not the sake of the debate. This is not the core of the debate, ladies and gentlemen, but we rather want to set the core on the debate on whether or not it is fair to take away the private ownership and put it back into public, and not how that process, like who actually deems what is culturally or historically significant. Yeah, please.
If a private collector just paid $20 million on an exquisite piece of Brancusi, will he receive the money back from the state, or the state is going to take the sculpture and put it in the archives, and that's it?
I think this is irrelevant. First, if he has $20 million to buy the picture, actually, like, will that really hurt him to lose that? Second of all, we believe that you can negotiate some kind of refund with the people, not in monetary value, but rather in different values. Why is that? Because let's analyze why these people hold this art. They don't hold it because they like the art. They hold it because they speculate on the value, because they want a rise in the value there. And we think this has nothing to do with art, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this is significantly wrong towards the meaning of art. Why is art important? Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is the thing that separates humans from animals. It is this thing that comes directly out of the human spirit, which is not led by interest, but which is rather created by creative forces. You cannot coerce art. You cannot buy art into existence, ladies and gentlemen. It just is. And it is one of the things in our humanity that we embrace and that we build art faculties and everything for, where we say, all right, this is something important which is not measurable by any market forces or by any monetary value. So why do we want that? And why don't we see that this is a problem, like taking away this value of 20 million, which is fiat, by the way. Like somebody imagined that it is 20 million. Maybe he paid for that picture, right? Well, it was his own fault that he actually paid it. The art itself, it can't be quantified. Well, let me come back to yeah, no, sit down. Let me come back. So why do we want to do that? Because we believe that private and art don't mix well and create exploitation in regards to access of the picture, of the art. Second, because the private ownerships creates a separation of classes, which means that you can only access art if you're rich. You can only look at Picasso pictures if you have money, if you spend these $20 million. And I don't believe that this is, all right, this is okay. So then you will say that, yeah, but we have these private donators and they give it to this museum so that they can exhibit. Well, why can't these private owners then actually donate the picture in fully, like give up the ownership? If they just leave it in the museum for that to hang there and then later decide, oh no, you know what, the price of the picture has risen and I'm going to sell it. This is not how art works. Please sit down. Second, and this is like the most important piece in this debate, because the artists themselves possibly wouldn't want that to be. They don't want a commodification of their art. They want the art to be itself, to work by itself. And second, and the last point is because the private owners, most of the time they don't like the art themselves. I'm going to take you in a minute. They don't like the art for itself, but because the art is a speculative object which will get a rise in value. Please.
The contemporary artist, like Banksy, for example, does a masterpiece. Will the state take it away from him?
Well, he has a right for. I'm lacking the English word. He has the intellectual right to the picture, right? but he does not own anything while he lives. But we're talking about historically and culturally significant stuff, like people who are already dead, for example, who are not able to own these rights. Like we have this in music, where old songs get into public domain and everybody can use it. Why cannot that be with other art as well, ladies and gentlemen? We don't see the reason. And Bansky, of course, he did it all without any money in intent. So when you're trying to portray us something with a monetary analysis, this is not in accordance with Banksy, who's very anti-capitalistic, who is very anti-commodification. So our main goals, and this is what Robert will tell you about, our main goals is the access of the art to as many humans as possible, because this is the essence of art, to speak to the heart of the humans. And second of all, the preservation of the art, not only for the public, but also for forever. And we believe that if we have a public domain owned art, then this is the best way to actually enable everybody to see it without class, without income, without speculative intentions, where you can then just take away the picture out of the museum and say, no, I'm not going to exhibit it there. And thirdly, because we believe that it is against the art itself to commodificate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, I don't do that. Thank you. 1 minute, please. Thank you very much, Alexander and Andrew. You now have the floor.
Hello everybody, and today we as a opposition strongly believe that that exist the bad times of your economy in your country, which can lead to some problem with your art. And what I'm going to talking about? I'm going to talking about this crisis in which we should do all that we can do to save this art that have some historical significance for us. And I'm gonna tell about two things: why it will be better when you can save this, and why we will able to save this, with this, when we can send this art to some businessmen, and why the situation with ASE will not be so strongly changed. Strong change like in our days. And but firstly, we will agree with our government that art is very important for us, and we said that it's very important to save it. Okay, it will be better when you can save this art, because to keep it in good condition, it costs so much money, because you should do many things. You should sometimes you should recall or some art, some pictures, or doing something like that. And we think today that when your country in a bad situation, when it's economic crisis, and you cannot spend so much money to this art, or it's just not your first. It's not your main thing that you want to spend. No, thank you. Later. It's not the first thing that you gonna to spend your money. It's will be better to just sell it to the some businessmen, and we don't see anything bad in the fact that they will be earn some money by using this, because we think that's yeah. Okay, question.
Do you see art to be a representation of social values, and that despite the costs incurred, it's still important for society to value it in spite of economic strife?
Yeah, okay. I agree with you that it's really important to people to see this art, to see this picture. But if this economic crisis and it's some risk that we can just lose this art, just lose this picture, and people will never able to see them, we think that in this situation we must save this picture by doing it, by giving it to a businessman. And now I want to explain you why businessmen can save this money, save this art. Because they interested in profit. Okay, if they will make some exhibition with some money that you should pay to come in, we think that it's good because they interested in this profit, and they will save this art, this picture in a good condition because it's will be profitable for him too, because people want to see the good. Okay, yeah.
If these businessmen are interested in profit, doesn't that necessarily mean that they're not invested in the social or cultural value of the art itself?
Can you repeat this?
If the businessmen are invested solely in the profit that they can accrue from a piece of art, does that not mean necessarily that they are not interested in the social and cultural relevance of said art?
Okay. As I understand the question, we don't see anything bad if he buy it just for his profit, just to earn money. We don't see anything bad with it because in the risk, in the situation, when we can just lose this picture, when people will never see that. We think that it will be better if people will see it later. So no, thank you. And why do you think that people will see it in the future? Because in the future, this picture will be safe, and you as a government, when you will be in a better condition, your economy will be better. You can just buy this picture, buy this art from this businessman to you, and you can just give it to all people like we saw it today. But what changes? What changes? Because we think today that it's really important to you to show this picture to your people, and if you have a risk to lose it, you should do all that you can to not to lose the things. And what will happen with ASE? They say that ASE will be changing very big, but we don't think so because this still exists in status quo. The enter to a lover is not free. You should pay some money, and of course somebody cannot pay this money. We think that it exists in our days, and we think that if situation will change for a little in a future, we don't see anything bad with anything bad in it.
On that point,
Just.
But don't you see that this private ownership of art is just a monopolistic power, and then that owner, he can put any price on that he wants, and that this is actually hurting the social value of the picture?
Okay, we think that he's right because he take this picture in the crisis time. He make his make some actions when in crisis time, when in your country it will be crisis. It maybe will really hard for him, but he still did it, and we think that it's okay. He made something for this art, and it's okay if he will set his own price for this picture. But what is my okay? Of course.
So there's this saying, buy when there's blood on the streets. So it is fair that he bought the picture when nobody had money, that it was like really, really cheap, and now he rips us off by taking many euros for us to go into the exhibition.
I think there is not problem at all, because in one case when you can just lose this picture, we want to save it. We want the people to see it in the future. So, what is my case about? If it's a government decision to sell something, if we often do it in a rare case when our economy in a bad position, in a bad condition, and it's what we needed to save this art of picture, because we all know that this art is very important for us. We agree in this with our government, and today we think that if it's important for us, we should do all that we can do to save it. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much for your speech. I now call upon the Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Michael. Dear ladies and gentlemen inside this room, we want to challenge something which is the status quo, the private ownership of significantly, historically and culturally significant art. I want to talk about the access to this kind of art, and I want to talk about the preservation of this kind of art and the necessity for preservation and why the state, the public, can care to that necessity better than a private businessman or whatever. But first of all, some words of rebuttal to the opposition leader. He just pointed out a picture of a businessman, draw a picture of a businessman. He uses art as an investment, and as an investor, he has the incentive to keep that art. What is wrong with that premise? This premise is wrong because the problem is there is a danger that, first of all, the importance of the art will be assessed by that investment and businessman. So this businessman will assess and reassess art again and again. So investment strategies, we know that, might change. And so art, which is considered very important by the public, might be for that businessman, for that purpose, not important and turn out to be not important. So he will invest less in maintaining this art. He will invest less in keeping this art safe, and he will invest less in giving the public access to that art. So private ownership. The problem is we need access and preservation, not for every kind of art, but that art which is proven to be historically and culturally significant. Culturally on a national and regional level, and historically on an international level. It's important for mankind right now, and it's important for future generations. But first of all, I want to go into further detail. What is art exactly about? Significant art and art in general. Art is expressing emotions. It is also describing social issues. Emotions are, beside the rational mind, very important to humans. So, and they are very hard to express and describe properly, scientifically, or somehow. There is where art comes in. So, by painting and forming sculptures and things like that, emotions are described properly. So, significant art cares for that kind of expression. If this kind of art is significant for a significant number of persons. So expressions of emotions, those expressions of emotions that are important for a significant mass. Your question.
If a contemporary artist does a masterpiece and he donates it to his girlfriend, dedicates it to her, but then he dies, it's of incredible significance, cultural significance, would you take away that masterpiece from his girlfriend?
I think this question was answered. This kind of art has to be in state ownership because the state will preserve and keep the access for it. I will come into further detail later on. So, significant mass, it is relevant for significant mass, so it has a relevance on a regional and international level, like the Mona Lisa, like many other kind of art. So, private ownership versus state ownership. Of course, we challenge the freedom of ownership, and we challenge this freedom of ownership for a good reason. So the access and preservation for the masses of this significant art. Access and preservation. Why is the state better when it comes to access and preservation? Because the state, firstly, has the capability to care for those goals more, and he has the legitimacy to do that for the masses as well. Firstly, access. The masses want to enjoy, please sit down, want to enjoy and experience this significant kind of arts. The state can care for that because the state has the capabilities. The state owns museums, and he has this showroom capabilities in big museums, and he can open up these museums even for free for the masses if he wants that. when it comes to preservation, the state has also there more capabilities than the private owner, because the state has research laboratories generally and forensic capabilities to store and maintain this kind of art, this public property better. So, and he has also the legitimacy, because when it comes to the state, there is a public pressure on the state. A public, even more when it's a democratic state, there's more public pressure for the state to care for this significantly important kind of arts. Yeah, and there's also public responsibility to save this kind of art. So when it comes to art, we have to realize, especially when it's a significant art, the state is better because the state secures access and preservation and can care and will care for that preservation more. You disagree?
Then how come there are so many masterpieces that are just sitting in the basement of many museums, especially in developing countries that do not have the money to invest into actually preserving and giving access to art?
A counter question. Do you know how many masterpieces are stored in any cages and dungeons of businessmen who think that is not a big investment? So the bigger problem is with the private ownership. Of course, we know there are poor countries in Africa, Egypt or Ghana and Uganda, and we know they care very good for their cultural heritage, and they invest a lot. So there might be some exceptions there, but the danger with the private ownership is much higher and explicitly higher. So what did we tell you? We told you what is art exactly. It's important for the emotional expression of humans. What is significant art? It's the art which is significant for a significant mass on a regional level or the international level. For this generation or future generations. So this kind of art has to be saved by public state ownership, because the state is better in giving access and the state is better in preservation. That's why we reject private ownership when it comes to this kind of art. So we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. And now we move to Daria, who will close this half of the day. Hello.
Thank you for the floor. So first, government told us how private owners are terrible for the art, that they deny public access to that. And I have just one question. So why in that situation state or government decide to sell some particular pieces of art? And we have several responses to it. So in my speeches I will tell you about that. First of all, in a lot of situations it is necessary for art to be safe. Moreover, we believe that people in some situations will have more access to that particular piece of art. Then we will talk about legitimacy of that action, because we believe that just taking some piece of art away from its owners is completely legitimate thing. And the last one about some new artists. So first of all, how is it better if you are talking about art? So Andrea already told you that actually actually, in some situations, if we are talking about crisis or if we are talking about just some poor countries, they just have not enough money to keep all pieces of art in good condition because it requires a lot of money, it requires some renovation or something like this. And why it is so important? Because first of all, they told us that state is more capable in investing in some piece of art. But we tell you that there are some situations in which it is not. And state and government understand that this piece of art are very important and that they as a state cannot care about this particular piece of art, that particular historical building, for example. That's why the only way how they can save it is just to sell it to some private owners. Moreover, we believe that it's important for state to enforce some conditions on what you can sell it. For example, you may tell this private businessman that, for example, I will sell it to you, but you will have to open it to public, for example, that people are able to visit. Yes, you may take some price, for example, but at least people can come and visit. Moreover, we believe that the next condition may be that you have to keep it in good condition, otherwise we will take it away from you. We believe that it's actually the status quo, how it's happening in some poor countries that are unable to care about all historical buildings or pictures. That's why we believe that, first of all, if state has no money, that means that on the comparison, we believe that it's much better on our side of the house because at least private investors have some money to invest and to keep it in good condition. Moreover, we believe that it's very important that we, because otherwise, without money we may lose because some buildings are just being destroyed or some pictures being destroyed, and it's first of all will be much harder and much more expensive to then restore it again. So if we lose some pieces of art, we may lose them forever. We think that art is very important, and that's why we should care about every piece of art. That's why we believe that on our side of the house we win that comparison that actually even if some investors do not see any values in this art, they will have to care about it. Moreover, we believe that if they have to provide some public access or if it's their businesses, so that means that they want to exhibit some particular piece of art, that means that they need to keep it in good condition to attract some visitors. That's why we believe it's still better on our side of the house. No, thank you. That's why we believe even moreover, we believe that it's not the likely scenario as they told us that private investors will just set up some unbelievable price and no one can assess it. Because first of all, if it's their business, they're interested in people coming, discussing, so they're interested that a lot of people will come. Moreover, if we're talking about some private galleries, they also compete with each other, whose gallery is better, who is cheaper, and etc. That's why we believe that they need to be cost efficient. Next thing. And moreover, it's very important to notice here that it's a government decision, and we believe that government is capable of making the best decisions for its people, especially if we are talking about democratic countries, but even if we are talking about non-democratic countries, we believe that majority of governments are still interested in providing the best possible solution for their people. That's why we believe that if government decides that it cannot care about some piece of art, but it, for example, have to provide some welfare for the people, because in crisis a lot of people need some kind of welfare or something like this, and the government, no thank you, and the government decides that it's much better to sell, for example, this one picture that costs a lot of money, and to spend that money on some welfare or some social care or healthcare and etc. We believe that it's a government right to do it, and we believe that it will be at the end better for people. Okay, now, yeah, please.
But don't you see that the private owners, they insure the art, and then they get it stolen, and then they sell it twice and taking the insurance money, and then the picture is gone forever into the darkness and impossible to the access. If we destroy the private ownership, this will be impossible, and the picture will always be publicly
thank you for the law. First of all, it's just not true in majority of cases right now when we have private ownership. Second of all, as I told you, we as a state may make a condition that you cannot just steal it and no one will see it. Okay, now about the justice. So, well, actually we do not understand the mechanism how. So they told us that they will just take some piece of art from people, and we believe, no thank you, that it's completely legitimate. Because first of all, person just paid for it with money that he owed. We believe that that means that person deserves this money and deserved to own this piece of art because he just paid the amount of money that was negotiated. That's why we believe it has this person has the right to own it, and we believe that it's just illegitimate to take it. And moreover, we believe that it's just inefficient. That's why we don't have any basis to justify it. Moreover, we believe that if you own some picture, for example, or other thing for several years, for example, that means that you may have some emotional connection or some memories connected with a particular piece of art. That's why if we just take it away from you, we believe that that this people may suffer because this link will be destroyed. And we don't see any reasons for this because, as I and my team told you, it's just inefficient. And the last point about some new artists. Actually, we believe that, as I told you, we believe that just private galleries and private collectors are very important, play a very important role in developing of art itself. And that's why we believe that it's very, well, with your law, if we take some significant pictures from them, that means that they may lose a lot of profits because less people will go, for example, to the private galleries. Moreover, they cannot buy some new, significant and very famous pictures, something like that. That's why they again will lose their profits. Why these profits is very important? Because private collectors or private galleries invest a lot of money in developing new artists. They provide some new artists with some kind of subsidies, or they just invest their money in in looking at new artists and finding something that they think may become a masterpiece. If these private galleries will have less resources, it means that it's much harder for them to work, to provide some scholarship for young artists, or just to send people to search for something interesting. That's why we believe that it will be much harder for us to develop some new piece of art, which is very important to bring in our society new ideas and to bring in our society some positive change. So is it 7 minutes or?
Yes.
So 7 minutes. Okay. So for all these reasons, we believe that it's inefficient, illegitimate. For all these reasons, we are going to oppose.
This is excellent. Thank you very much for the entire first half. Until the second half of today, I call upon
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I am proud to stand with side government in supporting the motion that this House should prevent private individuals from owning art deemed to be culturally or historically significant. Now, before I get into rebuttal of some points, I'd just like to remind the side opposition that we've defined art to be this expression of human spirit, creative force, and an embrace of humanity, as opening government has stated. It's a reflection not only of an individual's understanding of culture, but of the greater historical and social context in which this art is created. And the importance of this lies in the culture that this art represents. Now, side opposition would have us believe that that art can only be saved and preserved if the government does not repossess it, if private individuals are allowed to own this art. Now, the problem with this argument is that it essentially is commodifies art. It commodifies art into being something that is solely for profit and has nothing to do with social or historical relevance. It has nothing to do with culture. And the problem with this is that we create a culture of commodification. Not to mention that the cost of upkeep of art, of restoration, is perfectly within reason, especially considering the budgets of most governments. The cost of restoration, the cost of upkeep is minimal compared to the cost of certain other expenses, which side opposition has most wonderfully pointed out, including education and welfare. Side opposition has also discussed the idea of individual emotional attachment. I'd like to point out again that the art that we are discussing is art that has been deemed to be socially or historically or culturally relevant. That, by definition, precludes any individual emotional attachment. I'll take you in a minute. any individual emotional attachment to the art, because the social attachment to the art and the cultural relevance of it by far exceeds any individual importance assigned to this art, especially if it's been in the public domain for long enough that it's been deemed to be relevant and it's been deemed to be part of a cultural or historical narrative. I'd also like to point out some questions about that were not in the scope of the debate regarding unpublished art. If art is unpublished, that it cannot be deemed culturally or historically relevant, therefore it has no place in this debate. And now, I'll take your question before I move on.
If I have worked my entire life and saved money to buy a Monet because I really love the artist, I want to have a Monet, what right does the government have to steal it away from me? To put it
Your
in
individual
museum?
attachment to Monet has no relevance to the cultural or historical relevance of the Monet. It has no bearing on whether this art deserves to be in the public domain or not. Does not the public deserve just as much to learn from the Monet, to understand its cultural and social relevance, and understand its value to the people not only of Monet's time, but also in our culture of art today? It's not up to one individual to decide what is culturally relevant and what isn't. And this brings me to the crux of my argument, which is the idea of the commodification of identity and culture. The problem with allowing art to be privately owned is that we allow individuals to decide what can be culturally relevant and what isn't. We allow individuals to say, this is what I think people should be allowed to have access to. And this, by definition, precludes a public understanding of the subject. It precludes cultural relevance. It precludes social and historical relevance. And we can't allow this to happen. We can't allow art that reflects a socially determined identity to be kept from the very society for which it was intended. You brought up artistic intent earlier in stating that an artist who wanted his piece to go to a certain person should be allowed to say so. But the problem is that once that art becomes socially relevant, the artist's intent for private ownership no longer matters. If it's relevant, it belongs to the public. Art reflects context, it reflects culture, it reflects identity, and these are concepts and ideas that belong to the public. It is not up to the private individual, no matter how rich he or she or they is, to say that this belongs to the individual and not to the public. It's not up to them to define what is and is not relevant. Moreover, this becomes a symbolic removal of this relevance from the cultural or historical narrative. If we allow, as in your example, if we allow a rich businessman to own a Monet that he's saved up for 20 years, that's a symbolic removal of this Monet from the cultural narrative. It's a removal from the artistic community. It's a removal from the public domain. And while that private individual may be so kind as to put it on display, no thank you, that private individual also maintains control over the art, maintains control over its exposure, over its access, and that restricts its access to the public domain. It restricts the educational value of it, it restricts the cultural and social value of it, and by doing so, we therefore symbolically reduce the relevance of art in its whole. And art, as we know, is extremely socially and culturally relevant because it defines humanity. As we've said, it defines the human spirit and creative spirit. It's a reflection of our humanity, of our culture, of our core raw emotion. And if we are not allowed to access that in the public domain, what are we then saying to the public? We're saying that they are not allowed to access emotion. We're saying that there's certain culture that they simply can't pay for. Furthermore, you brought up the idea of accessibility, that somehow private ownership and maintaining upkeep of galleries would actually make things more accessible, and that people should in fact have to pay the entrance fee at the Louvre, should in fact have to pay to access art. Now the problem with this is this actually completely negates your argument of economic privilege. You said that it would be easier for people to be able to see it. That makes no sense. If I have to pay to see art, then that by definition means that someone who is poorer than me cannot see it if they cannot afford the ticket. No thank you and no thank you. And this brings me to my final point, which is that intellectual property that is privately owned is misused and not showcased as per its intended purpose. If we allow private individuals to own art, if we allow them to maintain control over who can and cannot see it, we therefore destroy the purpose of the art itself, which is to reflect culture, it is to reflect social context or historical context. If we don't allow the public to access this, the art itself loses its relevance. Art is relevant only insofar as the public can understand it and the public can access it and the public can derive some form of meaning from it. And if they cannot do so, then the meaning of this art is negated. We simply we can't allow that to happen because The entire relevance of art is determined by its access to an audience. The intention of art is always to reach some audience, whether that audience for the original artist was an audience of one, as in the case of the Mona Lisa and the privately commissioned portrait, or an audience of many. It still doesn't matter. Once the thing becomes culturally relevant, it has to remain accessible to an audience. Otherwise, it completely loses its relevance, it loses its place in the culture, and then we lose our own component of human culture and human identity. Thus, the commodification of culture and the commodification of identity cannot be allowed, and this is why I strongly oppose any private ownership. This House should prevent the private ownership of art deemed to be culturally and socially relevant.
Anna, thank you very much for your speech. I said it finally correctly. And I gladly at this point call upon, what should I write here? Laura? Laura. Laura, please, the floor is yours.
The value of art is given by the value that the viewer seems to give it to. So we think that in that sense, it's very difficult to say that art is more valuable to the public than is valuable to the individual, because we think that it has to be valuable to anybody who sees it or anybody who wants to own it in that respect. And that's why we think that it's very hard to actually say for sure that the public deserves it more, right? That's why I'm gonna have, like, my own argument, my own extension is gonna be about the right of ownership and why that is fundamentally important, and like the actual consequences that it has in present, and why we think that ownership shouldn't be to the state but to the individual, or either, but rather just have a choice in that sense. But before that, I'm going to tackle this whole point of sort of collective or public ownership that the government team has brought today, right? So first of all, we think that in terms of this commodification, right? We don't think that this necessarily applies to the motion. We only talk about art that state will deem worthy of not commodifying. So if that applies, that applies to any single piece of art in the world, not just the ones that the state says, hey, this is valuable for our culture and history, so this is not commodification. So we think that in that sense, if they want to run that argument about commodification, it's an argument that will apply to any type of art specifically, not to just the art that the state will deem valuable in that respect, right? We don't think it applies to emotion, right? So in that sense, let's talk about the other stuff. First of all, they tell us that it should be collective. First of all, we don't think it should be collective. Art is highly subjective, therefore it's very hard for a bunch of people to say this is valuable for our culture and our history and this is not. We think that applies in many different cases. For example, in terms of minorities, is art that is nationalist, for example, viable or even valuable to cultural minorities, for example, or ethnic minorities that will have to pay taxes in order to gain that art? We think it's very difficult to decide in that respect if art is equally valuable for everybody in the society. Second of all, in terms of control, first of all, we think that first have probably dealt with that. You can just force them to show it from time to time. We think that accessibility is not really the motion. In that sense, you can, for example, archive them in your national library and just have copies of that piece of art that would be accessible for everybody, and everybody will be able to see it, everybody will be able to know its history. It will be equally valuable for everyone. We're discussing the right of ownership, not accessibility. We have many different alternatives in order of accessibility there, right? But last but not least, we disagree with the basic principle that just because it's valuable to the public, we should give it to the public. In that sense, my money is valuable to the public. It could save lives. My building, my house could be valuable to the public, but the state doesn't collectivize it. Why is this specifically important to art, and how does this change the norms and the rules that our society is ruled by, right? Okay, let's talk about the right of ownership and why we think that's important. First of all, we talk about ownership to the artist, like the primordial sort of owner, right? We think that either when he's alive or dead, we think that whether he sells it or it's for economical, emotional, altruistic reasons that he gives away this art, we should respect that wish. And it's really disrespectful to say we don't respect that wish, it becomes valuable to the public, so what the artist wanted in the first place is no longer important, right? We think that in real life that will distort incentives of artists to create specific types of art, right? And we disagree with that. Second of all, let's talk about the current owner. And in that sense, first of all, that could be, for example, the family, right? It could be a family inheritance. So I'm going to have more categories, right? It could be inheritance, you could buy it, or it could be given to you by the artist, or so on. So let's talk about inheritance. We think that in that sense, it's valuable to the owner and it's just abusive to take it away. It's not just about giving the money back. It's the fact that it could be a family inheritance, something that your Austrian family has received from, during the Habsburgic, times, and it could be a picture that is incredibly valuable for your family, and we don't think that is more valuable to the public in that sense. In that sense, we think it's more important to talk about, for example, royal families that may own a lot of art that is valuable, that are exhibiting to the public. Like, for example, the crown jewels. Who will you give the crown jewels to? Will they belong to the royal family, or will they belong to the British state? And in that sense, we think that it's important to have this kind of perspective that ownership should be private, and in the sense of inheritance, it could be valuable to the individual, and we should not take it away. Second.
Does not a royal family owning these pieces of art constitute state ownership? And also, if you force private individuals to display art publicly, does that not also come with limitations? Can't private individuals still place limitations on the accessibility of it? No, not necessarily. Just being owned by a royal family doesn't mean that it's owned by the government. And B, generally not. Like, he can place limitations, but we think that when you buy the art, when you sign the contract, the state can limit the way in which you own the art, and, for example, force you to put it in archives so that everybody has access to it, which is the case for most art. And it's relevant art, by the way, right? Let's talk about the situation in which you actually bought that art, right? Because first half talked a lot about how individuals are just businessmen and they want to preserve that art. We think that's true in a lot of senses, right? But it's not just that. It's charities, it's universities and museums that can own that art. It can be individuals that just love art. It can be individuals that just want to invest in art. It could be a combination of two. It could be other artists literally buying art for its value, right? We think it's especially important to allow these people to own this art. We don't think that this framing that they're just business oriented is necessarily valuable. We think that art is valuable to individuals, and in that sense they should be able to own it, right? Why is this specifically and that situation in which you simply own it and somebody gives it to you? And I think the PI that Dexter put that, what if I donate my art to my girlfriend? Should it take away? We think that's really immoral even after that, and it could be a very relevant family or individual heritage. No. Why is this specifically important? First of all, it's just abusive. It collectivizes art with no specific reason, right? But second of all, we think that it distorts incentives on the art market. In what sense? First of all, it does not allow private individuals to sort of cast their vote on the art market, right? It just says, the state says, this is valuable to our culture, so this should be highly priced. This is relevant, you should buy this. We think that in that sense, art that is not so conventional, or art that the state does not deem as being important, and in that sense, more times the state will be conservative in their art choices. We think that will not be able to develop. It will be deemed unworthy by the market, and prices will fall. We think this is really relevant for artists, right? Not just because of money, but simply because you're deeming their art completely unworthy, and it's unfair for their own recognition of them being important artists, right? But moreover, we think that it's important to allow individuals to own this art, and we think that we have proven how this could be accessible and how these people could actually take care of it and put it there for the public. Thank you.
speech, and I call on Ahmed to for the government.
Mr. Speaker, we say that art is a driver. It is a representation. It is a representation of social values, and when those social values are put into the public domain, we think it contributes to a collective sense of identity. That collective sense of identity should not be commodified. It should not be differentially valued by people who have the luxury to value it, and it should be preferentially given to the public for whom they are the intended audience. Now, with regards to the girlfriend example, which kept recurring through this debate, if individual artists choose to represent themselves to their girlfriends in any way, such as cutting off their ear and sending it to them, we have no problem with that, okay? In fact, the state doesn't want that kind of art. But let's talk about the kind of art we do want, because we think that our case presupposes three things. Number one, it presupposes that if individuals own art, it will not be in the public domain, because if it is in the public domain, then the state technically owns it, right? Okay, and number two, we're not talking about the unpublished art, which goes from individual to individual. We're not talking about books that haven't been published yet, because those books don't ever get a readership. Those things are irrelevant, and we can't quantify how valuable those things are, because our definition, as opening government said, is based on how society values it after it is published. And thirdly, this importance is again self-defining. We don't think we need to define this importance. We don't think this importance is monetary. We think this importance is intangible. We think it's qualifiable, not quantifiable. We think people and the collective define what this importance is. So the main thrust of our argumentation is as thus. We say that paying money for the ownership of artistic self-expression is unfair. It is inherently against what art is, which is what the main crux of this debate was about. Okay? We think that expression needs an audience, no thank you. And that if you do buy art, you necessarily affect this audience-viewer relationship. We think this is necessary because when you affect this reciprocity, you're saying that is transferable, is commodifiable, and that because you can buy it through a transaction, equally the meanings and values associated with it can also be bought via transactions. We don't like that, and we don't think you can equate the monetary value of art with the intangible value of art. Okay? Sure.
An artist that creates for the collective good of their society can and could have donated the art to the state directly. We're talking about the situation in which the artist doesn't want to do this, so we choose to give it or sell it to somebody else.
That argument is self-defeating because society would not have seen it as important if it never reached society in the first place. That was one of the main provisos of our argument, in that we assume the art is published in some way in the public domain, so that it has a viewership, right? So we think that there were two main issues in this debate. Number one, what side of the house best represents art in a fair way? What is closest to the true ideals of art? And number two, which side of the house is better able to maintain this art? Now, we have a dichotomy of public ownership and private ownership. And we say that private ownership is inherently decadent. In allowing people to commodify art, you're saying that they can do so because they have the freedom to do so, because they can ascribe value. But you yourself said that an individual can decide how valuable something is. If that truly is the case, how can the state decide that a private owner's individual valuation of art outweighs the public's valuation of that art? Equally, the public could have a very high valuation of that art. So who's to say that the owner is more deserving? Surely then it is only a monetary incentive which allows for you to make that determination. No, thank you. More importantly, we think that this is, again, not in lieu with what an artist would have wanted. An artist would have ideally wanted for his audience to see that. We don't think that the reciprocity of the artist-audience relationship is maintained when that art is taken out of the public domain and given to a private collector who we think largely does so because they appreciate value, they don't appreciate art. And that is inherently not what art should be about. Okay? So what we said in the upper house, we told you that importance is defined by general consensus. We didn't receive sufficient reply to this. They haven't told us why importance should not be defined by general consensus, why the individual does have the right to determine for themselves why their importance is more important than society's definition of importance, why our intangible importances aren't as valuable as their tangible importances, their valuations. They haven't explained to us anything about social discourse and why it's necessary that we allow these things to be in the public domain when they represent a collective sense of identity. What they did tell us, though, is art is costly. We think that yes, the cost is negligible given the amount that governments spend every year on military defense budgets, on education, on things like that. Probably the cost of maintaining that art is relatively negligible in comparison. And more importantly, surely if that art is deemed important, it would be important enough for the state to redirect funds to maintain that art, to preserve that art. Surely the Eiffel Tower is monumental enough in France's history for Paris to want to maintain the upkeep of the Eiffel Tower. If it fails to do so, surely the state has failed, right? It's not art which has failed. It is the state which has failed in its duties in maintaining that art and maintaining cultural expression in a way that's appropriate for its people.
Sir,
Yes.
in former communist countries, there are a lot of buildings that are so beautiful and so valuable to society that lie decrepit because the communist state collectivized them, ignored them, and just gave it back to people when they didn't mean anything else.
And again, we would argue that that's a failure of an individual state. It's not a failure of art being an expression in the public domain or a collective sense of identity. It's not related to what we think art is and what art should be represented by. That's an individual government's shortcomings. And those shortcomings probably exist in the health system, in the education system. It's not specific to art. Okay? Now, what we said furthermore on the lower half is we're talking about the denying public access, right? We're saying that if denying public access doesn't mean that you're going to take care of this better. We contend that the state can take care of this better. Why do we contend so? Because we think that private owners, again, essentially buy these things for vanity. They're more likely, in their contention, to keep these things in their dungeons or in their cellars or whatever morose kind of storage method you have, okay? And that in doing so, they're less likely to preserve it. The state, we think, has a vested interest in doing so. They argue private ownership equals better art. We argue private ownership equals better business of art. That's not what art is about. That's not what we want. And again, if the government fails to maintain that art, the government has failed in its duties. It's dereliction of the government's duties of maintaining a cultural identity. It's not the failure of art in and of itself. Now, what closing opposition brought to us is they said that they would make artists showcase the art. Well, in whatever way you do this, you're essentially saying that whatever freedom you've given them, you're now rescinding because you've accepted that there is some collective importance in representing this art. Essentially, you're making it, again, state-owned if you do make it meaningfully showcaseable to the public. And this, again, proves our point that the value cannot be ascribed by individuals. It's decided by the state, who represents the cultural and collective identity of its people. For all these reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Ahmed, thank you very much. And finally, to end this, I call upon Andre. Thank you very much.
Today, the opposition was eccentric, to say the least. Because what they believe nowadays is that if someone believes that something is more valuable than another person, then that individual that values that object more deserves it. If the public values a piece of art more, if the state decides that it is valuable, then it deserves it. That's it. This is exactly their point. We today on the side of opposition, provided you with concrete analysis, not just allegations or assumptions, about how ownership really works, why we believe certain people deserve some things and certain other people don't deserve other things. We've coagulated this into a more complex vision of the world, of how the economy works, of how we can preserve art more. And in order to conclude this debate, I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about preservation and access, and how we prove that private owners can help in preserving art better. Second of all, I'm going to talk about ownership. Now, let's talk about preservation and access. Because first of all, we believe that in many moments you can just impose a lot of regulations on owners if they're unreasonable and do not want to allow access to those pieces of art. They want to destroy it or anything. We already do that for historical buildings, for example. If your home is a historical building, you can't just break it down and rebuild it in whatever shape you want. You have to maintain it in a certain way. We can do this with art as well. So to a certain extent, there's preservation access point that was predominant in the first government really does not stand. But what we have added even more is an analysis of how exactly does the state work indifferent from private entities. And the state is mostly a bureaucratic institution. It is very hard for the one that does the entire budget of the state to really understand how much money are necessary to allocate for and are needed by the minute and specific museums that require these money to actually preserve art. So even though the state might have the money, there's a bureaucratic process into actually getting to preserving art. And even more, bureaucrats have a very little incentive to actually take good decisions in that direction. On the other hand, private art collectors, they are emotionally invested in the specific art pieces that they purchase. And so they have the most incentive to actually take good care of them. So we see, and we've brought you examples. For example, in Romania, when the communist state just nationalized a lot of art pieces, they just the state managed to wreck most of them, especially buildings. And we have seen that this is happening not only in Romania, not an isolated example. There are many, many examples of misconducts in terms of museums, even in developed states, for example, at the Louvre. No, thank you. Now, let's talk about ownership in general. Because we believe, and we have explained to you, that first of all, ownership is something that you kind of derive from the right to bodily integrity. I have my hands. My hands connect this piece of, this paint with this canvas and create something. So my hands have created it. If you take away my, if you say that that thing does not belong to me, it means that my creation, something I have done with my hands, are something I do not deserve. It means that I technically do not deserve the very creation of my own body. So I do not deserve the autonomy to create things with my own body. It is a violation of my right to bodily integrity in itself. Even more, we believe, well, before that, no, I'm going to take closing. This is a good time.
Nowhere in this debate did we talk about intellectual rights to property. This is about private ownership insofar as we can define what belongs to the public and what doesn't. And the fact that you created it does not mean that you can control its cultural relevance.
Okay, it may become culturally relevant, but you still should control who owns it. And this is the differentiation that we have made and they have not. Because we believe that something may be valuable to the public. We believe that the public really could gain a lot from it, but it does not mean that the public deserves it. Because we believe that there's a distinction between valuing something and deserving something. For example, if I now create a block of flats, because really I work years and years into putting brick after brick into creating a block of flats, and the public may attribute value to it. Families may live in it. It does not mean that they should necessarily own it. And this is how the society as a whole works. We just do not offer it to other people. And we do not believe that artists are less entitled to their work than a person that builds a block of flats. So you either they should, if they want to run this argument, that you should establish ownership based on who values it more, not based on who built it, who created it, then they should run it for the whole range of issues, not just create a double standard for artists. And then they develop more into this esoteric idea that somehow, because art is something that is kind of intrinsic to culture, to the public, it's more esoteric than just other types of objects, then that public deserves it more. We have a couple of responses for that.
About deserve.
First of all, the public, like value is in many ways very subjective. I've seen at museums art pieces that I believe that are crap, and I've seen, and my father sometimes believes that art pieces I believe are amazing are crap. So that's immensely subjective, and we believe that the public in many ways will not really value art as much as they want me to buy. No, thank you. Even more, we believe that ownership is art is even more important. Because even if it may have some cultural relevance, we have already explained to you why it is specific that the art is the expression of the artist itself. When you create art, you put your body and soul into that art piece. It means that it is your identity that you're out of order, miss. It is your identity that you put in there. So even though that the public may, in time, identify with that identity, the culture of the whole nation may identify with it, it is intrinsically yours as the artist. And thus, for you to not have the right to sell it to whomever you want and that person to sell it to whomever he wants, it would mean that your identity is meaningless. It's something that can be taken away by the public. This was not just an esoteric analysis of value and identity. No, this will really impact everyday artists that believe that they should have the right to decide what they want to do with their creation. For example, an artist that believes in anarchy would hate the idea that the state should own its object. In that point in which he knows that his identity as an anarchist will be stolen by the state, he will just create less art. So the impact art in the real world, and it also does have very little moral basis for. And this motion has very little moral basis. Because of that, please, I beg you to allow true owners to keep their objects.